So our last meeting, we were talking about the Shemas, the names of Shem Elohim and Shem Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, as expressed in the Tanya, that is mid chapter 4. Based on the verse that was in the beginning of chapter 4, which says Ki hine ksiv ki shemesh umogen Hashem Elokim. The two names of Hashem Elokim, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, and the name Shem Elokim are like the sun, or as an analogy, like a sun and a shield. And we learned that that there's a representation of that within the midos, within the characteristics of Hashem, that being Chesed and Gevurah. Chesed being the idea of revelation of Hashem. Gevurah, Shem Elokim, is the expression of restriction. And by working those two midos together, we can make revelation within the world, but a revelation that's of the correct measure, so that created finite beings can appreciate it. So we discussed further that the aspects of Gevurah, the aspects of diminution of God's light, don't actually create anything that doesn't exist, but what it does is it creates a perception. It creates a perception of what we see in the world, and it creates perceptions of what exists in the world, that the things that we see in the world seem to have an independent reality from Hashem himself. And in our own consciousness, we feel separate, independent from, and from our perspective, that is certainly somewhat of a reality, but God made it that way, that we see ourselves as entities and beings, when in reality it is what we are nullified in the presence of Hashem, and that it's just that Hashem has made it that way, that we perceive ourselves as an entity, but really we are nullified in Hashem. And in fact, this is the capability of Gevurah, of restriction, that gives us this restrictive view, that it appears that we are conscious and separate, independent entities, when the reality is that it's Hashem who's the total reality. So continuing on with the words of the Tanya, Makol Mokom, nevertheless, even though we don't perceive godliness, and we can't perceive godliness in a visionary sense, it is Hashem is present and is everywhere. But in fact, this is the expression of Hashem's Gevurah, Hashem's might, Hashem's capability of restriction. Hein Gvurosov Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Tanya says, this is the capability of his self restriction, that it is so strong that we don't even realize that Hashem is restricting himself and restricting his presence, so that we don't perceive him, and instead of wondering and saying, I see a world, and Hashem has restricted himself to the extent where we can't perceive, or we don't perceive a God, to the extent where Pharaoh, in the story of the Exodus, in the Exodus narrative, says to Moses, who says, let my people go, he says, and who is the God who's sending you? And Pharaoh says, I don't know him. I don't recognize your God. So to that extent, God restricts his presence, but in reality, we should be thinking, we should be understanding that obviously God exists and obviously God created anything. But how come even I feel myself to exist in some sort of sense? And this is the restrictive or gvurosov of the Abishter, his might, that he restricts his expression of his revelation to that extent that we don't see him, and that because Hashem is so strong, Asher Kol Yochel, so since he is, after all, capability of everything, Asher Kol Yochel, it's Samsum Achayis Aruchnius Anishpa Maruach Piv, so that he is able to diminish and restrict the revelations that come from the breadth of his mouth, L'hastire, to hide himself, Shaloi Yavatul Guf Hanibra, so that the physical entity, the physical creations don't become actually nullified in their existence, like we spoke about in previous classes. And and even though, so we have to say that even though we don't perceive it, and even though we don't understand it, that is the reality. And that's what the Tanya continues to say. Ein b'seichel shum nivra lahasik mehusat tzimtzum hester, and this is not within the capabilities of any physical creation to understand. She'afal bikain gufa nivra me'ein liyesh, and even though Hashem has created that and continues to create us in such a restricted sense, something from nothing, we can't, and we don't perceive it, and that is just as much. Kamei she'eni yachelta b'seichel shum nivro lahasik mehusa bria, and just as much as we cannot understand or see or perceive this the nature of the created being, that he's been created something from nothing. Nevertheless, this is our existence, and this is the reality of our existence. Um, so So what we've said is that even though we can't understand the concept of creation, and because this is not within our own personal boundaries, since a human being cannot create from from a state of nothingness, but we do understand the idea of diminishment, restriction. We do understand that if I reduce the flow of information to a person, I can still make myself comprehensible and make it understood. Or, like I gave the example of the sunglasses, that I can comprehend better when I've got, or I can see better when I've got the sunglasses on from when there's glaring sun. But what God does is simultaneously give and withheld. And this is what the last lines that we said in the Hebrew, Hein Hein Gvurosov. This is his might. This is this is something which is only within the within the capability of the creator to be able to create from nothing at the same time, create from nothing simultaneously, as I gave the analogy of the person who throws up the rock up into the atmosphere, and it only stays up while your power is in it. Hashem is creating something from nothing, but at the same time, he's withholding, and so that we can perceive ourselves as as a as created entity, or even as independent entities. And um, and and while and while we are told, and while the Tanya is telling us that the human being can't understand it in its totality, nevertheless we can have an appreciation of it, and that in later chapters, and as part of influence of Hasidism, the idea that we can meditate and meditate on these ideas and think about them and feel that they are a great achievement, that brings us and allows us to make some sort of connection to Hashem, that we in our heart of hearts, or we in our mind of minds, can think to ourselves that we are not just we are not creations of ourselves, but we are dependent. We are not just, as we perceive ourselves, independent entities, but we are totally dependent on Hashem. And if we can take that to heart, then we can start to make connection points to God and godliness. Okay. The next parts of the chapter start to address these ideas and start to put them into the terminology and framework of Kabbalah, which the end of this chapter will start to introduce those terminologies and those words, and we will get there, and we will no doubt get there eventually. So, reading from the Koran edition, from the Steinsaltz edition, on page 85. The concealment of the Creator's light serves as a necessary condition to enable the existence of creation. As we've said before, this is the capability of the tzimtzum, the capability of the restriction, and then, as we said also, it's a necessary condition, and that's an enabler for the existence of creation. And as we've said, for the creation to not be totally subsumed and to be overpowered as we are in its source, as we've discussed previously, that source has to be hidden to the extent that creation perceives itself to be as independent. However, this perception of independence should not be confused with the capacity of free will. And another topic altogether, but human beings' free will. We're not speaking about the idea of free will at the moment, because that, when you have free will, you feel that you've got this independence, this independent capability to decide your own choices. But that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is, as I gave that rough analogy previously about the stepping down transformer on the electricity grid from 24,000 volts down to a usable 110 volts. We are in the presence of God's made strength, and if it wouldn't be that Hashem limits his own chesed, he limits his own kindness of giving, we would be put out of existence. So I'll just continue with this reading. So therefore, this idea of the tzimtzum is the root and origin of existence itself. That is to say, and I'm using the word tzimtzum as we've introduced it previously. Tzimtzum meaning the capability of diminution or the capability of gvura. So it's this gvura, or the diminution, or tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is the more Kabbalistic term for this idea, right? Creation. So the tzimtzum is actually, the capability of tzimtzum is the root and origin of the existence of everything, so that it doesn't become totally expired in its source. A creation exists as long as it maintains consciousness that it is not divine. The creation's perception of independence, despite the fact that its entirely spiritual and physical existence continued to be sustained by the grace of the Creator and his ongoing generosity, constitutes this um, mind-boggling wonder of the concept of Tzimtzum. And this, as we said before, can't be comprehended by a creation. But at the same time, as we mentioned before, Hashem creates and puts the Tzimtzum into place at the same time, and that is the wonderment, and this is the wonder of the of creation. And as he says on page 87, the creations are constantly being created anew, and yet are not conscious of that they are created at all. To the extent which, as I mentioned before, in the biblical narrative, the parrot could say, I don't recognize God. This idea of your own understanding of self, your own understanding of yourself, and your thinking of that your own independence, we're going to read some passages on that in our next session. So I'll leave it here at the moment until we start again.